In 1910, there were 155 medical schools in the United States. By 1935, there were 66. 89 medical schools, more than half of every institution training doctors in America, closed in 25 years. Not because they were failing, not because their students couldn't find work. Because one report, written by a man who had never attended medical school in his life, declared them incompatible with the new definition of science. That report was funded by the Carnegie Foundation. Its implementation was financed by John D. Rockefeller, and what it eliminated was not just schools. It was an entire competing model of medicine, one that had been practiced for centuries, that had its own clinical documentation, its own research traditions, and its own graduates successfully treating patients across the country. By the end of this video, you will understand what that medicine was, who specifically paid to have it removed, and why the document that did it is sitting in a public archive that anyone can read, and almost nobody has. That decision is still shaping every prescription you have ever been given. And it was made not by any elected government, not by any scientific consensus, but by two private foundations in a single decade. Let me start with what American medicine actually looked like before 1910, because most people have never been told. In the 19th century, American medicine was genuinely plural. There were allopathic physicians, the forerunners of what we now call conventional medicine, but they competed openly with homeopathic doctors, eclectic physicians, osteopaths, naturopaths, and practitioners of hydrotherapy and electrotherapy. These were not fringe practices. They had their own accredited schools, their own professional associations, their own peer-reviewed journals, and their own hospitals. Boston University School of Medicine had a full homeopathic curriculum. Drexel University, then known as Hahnemann Medical College, was one of the most respected homeopathic institutions in the country. Eclectic medical schools across the Midwest were training physicians in plant-based and indigenous medicine that drew on centuries of empirical practice. These schools existed. Their graduates practiced medicine. Their patients recovered. The clinical documentation of their results is in the historical record. Now, in 1908, the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching hired a man named Abraham Flexner to survey every medical school in the United States and Canada. Flexner was not a physician. He was not a scientist. He was not a medical researcher. He held a bachelor's degree in classics and humanities from Johns Hopkins University. He had run a preparatory school in Kentucky. He had never treated a patient. He was chosen for this role deliberately. The Carnegie Foundation's president, Henry Pritchett, stated explicitly that a non-physician was needed to ensure objectivity. What Pritchett did not state, but what the subsequent funding record makes unmistakable, is that a non-physician with no clinical experience and no competing loyalties to any school of medical practice would be far easier to direct toward a predetermined conclusion. Flexner visited all 155 medical schools. His report, published in 1910 as Medical Education in the United States and Canada, concluded that only schools teaching the pharmaceutical and surgical model of medicine, the model that required expensive laboratory equipment, hospital affiliations, and significant capital investment, met the standard of legitimate science. Homeopathy was dismissed as dogma. Eclectic medicine was called primitive. Naturopathy was declared incompatible with scientific principles. Electrotherapy, which had documented clinical applications, was removed from the category of legitimate medical practice entirely. The report did not present evidence that these approaches failed to treat patients. It simply declared them unscientific by the new definition of science that the report itself established. That is not a scientific finding. That is a circular argument in a published document. And it worked. Here is why it worked. And this is the part that the history books do not emphasize. The report itself was only a document. A document has no power to close schools. What gave it power was what happened immediately after it was published. Between 1913 and the 1930s, the Rockefeller Foundation donated over $50 million, equivalent to more than $10 billion in today's money, to medical schools across the United States. Every dollar went exclusively to schools teaching the pharmaceutical and surgical model. Not $1 went to a homeopathic school, an eclectic school, or a naturopathic institution. At the same time, state medical licensing boards, which determined which graduates could legally practice medicine, were restructured to require training at accredited schools. The accreditation standards were written in alignment with the Flexner criteria. So the mechanism was this: if your school did not teach the Flexner model, it could not receive accreditation. If it could not receive accreditation, its graduates could not obtain medical licenses. If its graduates could not obtain licenses, no student would enroll. And without enrollment, the school closed. The Rockefeller Foundation did not need to ban alternative medicine. It simply made alternative medicine unlicensable. And then it funded the infrastructure that made the licensed version the only version anyone could practice. 80% of homeopathic, eclectic, and naturopathic programs in the United States were gone within 20 years of the Flexner Report's publication. The Flexner Report itself is available at the Carnegie Foundation archive and has been digitized in full. It is a public document. The General Education Board financial records, showing exactly which schools received Rockefeller funding and on what conditions, are at the Rockefeller Archive Center in Sleepy Hollow, New York. The accreditation criteria changes that followed the report are in the American Medical Association's historical archive. All of it is documented. All of it is accessible. What is worth sitting with, what I have not been able to stop thinking about since I read through these records, is this. The medicine that was eliminated was not ineffective. It had been practiced for generations. It had its own clinical literature, its own trained practitioners, its own documented outcomes. It was not eliminated because it failed patients. It was eliminated because it was not profitable, because a physician trained in plant medicine, water therapy, or homeopathy did not need to prescribe petroleum-derived pharmaceutical compounds. And John D. Rockefeller, at the moment the Flexner Report was published, held controlling interests in the emerging petrochemical industry that was the primary source of pharmaceutical synthesis. That is not a conspiracy theory, it is a financial timeline. The Rockefeller business interests in petrochemicals are documented. The funding of pharmaceutical-only medical education is documented. The simultaneous defunding and closure of non-pharmaceutical medical schools is documented. The connection between those three documented facts is something you are allowed to draw yourself. The Flexner Report is available in full at the Carnegie Foundation archive. The Rockefeller Archive Center is at rockarch.org. The American Medical Association historical records are at the AMA's library in Chicago. Everything I have described tonight is a public document. What is no longer publicly available is the medicine those schools were teaching. The curricula were not preserved. The clinical traditions were not transferred. The knowledge that took centuries to build was simply discontinued. and the practitioners who carried it retired or retrained, and when they were gone, it was gone with them. 155 schools in 1910, 66 by 1935, 89 institutions, and everything they knew, erased in a single generation. In the last video on this channel, we looked at the universities that disappeared from American cities in the same decade, the same foundations, the same window, the same mechanism. If you have not seen that video, it is on screen right now. The pattern connecting these two stories is one of the most consequential things I have found in this research. Subscribe if you want to keep following these records, and leave me a comment. Is there a treatment, a remedy, or a medical practice that your grandparents used that doctors today have never heard of? Because I think what was lost in 1910 is still being lost. Every time a patient is told that something their family has used for generations is not real medicine,